Hello, good people. Did we do an acknowledgement of country, Ian? Has anyone got that? I can do it. I reckon I can do it. Who was that? Come up and do that. Yeah.
Hello everybody, I'm Trudy. I'm the PA at Ocean Floor Music, and before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're gathered on today and give my thanks to their elders, past, present and emerging, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Blycha, and Blycha means country, so yeah, how exciting. Thank you.
That's a beautiful segue, thank you so much. We don't always know where we're meeting when we get to digital. And one of the things we're doing by creating Web 3.0 and creating the metaverse is we're basically taking ourselves and we're replicating ourselves. There was a wonderful article a few years back in Wired magazine that talked about mirror world. And I think that most people here should have a good understanding that that's ultimately where we're going. And whether it turns out like Ready Player One, which is when I had the privilege of explaining to my children what I do as a technology lawyer who specialises in digital assets, Ready Player One was a fantastic way of trying to explain what is ahead of us. What is ahead of us needs to be governed, and what is ahead of us needs rules. So when you are accosted by lawyers who want to talk to you about the metaverse, you should not be distressed. You should be very, very grateful that we're here, because code is not infallible, and code at this moment in time is still written by people, and people tend to create errors in code, and there's algorithmic biases. And so we want to make sure that the future world that we create, the digital twin of ourselves, is not just a replica of the fractured creation that we are, but is potentially even better than what we are. So if it is that the only thing that we do as an industry and a blockchain group is to chase the next token raise, and I'm preaching now, but I'm very passionate about this. But if that's the only thing that everybody in here is here to do, then I suggest we are going to create a very ugly next digital twin of ourselves. So what does that have to do with data? One of the big differences in the metaverse is the creation of property that is in digital form, so it can be endlessly replicated. And the solution of the blockchain or distributed ledger technology is to create an immutable record that helps us to stop that double spend problem. Digital assets change over time, and when they change, they collect and accrue data. And who here thinks you can own data? Put your hands up. Oh my God, you're a very, very sophisticated group. You can't own data. Aside from some little legal nuances, you can't actually own data. And considering it's considered the oil of our future selves, it should be enlightening to you to know that you can't own data, but you can control data. Where data gets really messy is because these new assets that we are creating, digital assets, cryptocurrencies, smart contracts, they're owned by multiple people at the same time. And when we own things, we like to be able to control them. And that is why our beautiful and wonderful and highly intelligent panel today is coming from a law firm, Sterling and Rose, and also Jacques is also a lawyer at Herbert Smith Freehills, and I know that he's a digital law specialist because I used to work with him. And Jacques' background prior to becoming a technology lawyer was that he was a computer scientist. So he is one of the wonderful bridge people who's able to articulate both of those realms. So what we're going to do to talk to you today is about some of the things, if you're in product development or if you are somebody who's just a community builder, whatever you are, some of the things you need to think about in terms of governing data, because data can be a weapon and data can be a shield. And data can be spectacular when it lights up the truth of who we are. And on that note, I'm going to ask you, Rachel Howard, how is it that you came to be interested in data stewardship, and what does that even mean?
Thanks, Natasha. Let's test the mic. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's just so beautiful to be here. We're staring, for anyone who's looking streaming, we're actually staring at yachts and sparkling water out there. I don't know if you got to do that in Sydney or Melbourne, but that's the gift of Perth. Just by way of introduction, how did I come to data stewardship? So I am sitting here today with having worn a few hats. I spent a lot of my career as a consultant doing work with what we would call the incumbents of industry, the big businesses of Australia, and helping them on their digital transformation journeys. So I walked the halls trying to innovate in those big corporate settings, but found that as we were accelerating out those digital transformations, there was a piece of justice missing, and we weren't thinking as carefully about the value of data and the power it has, and how we want the power balance to sit as we build the future. So I spent a couple of years with a philanthropic hat on, and I led an initiative that was focused on internet regulation at the Minderi Foundation called Frontier Technology. And that's actually where Natasha and I met each other. We were starting to think about what should be the future rules of the internet, and how do you actually translate. The piece of work we did together was how do you translate that into the day-to-day activities of everyday businesses. And so and I guess now that the hat I'm wearing now today is as the Chief Operating Officer of a brand new law firm that's thinking directly about these problems of what should the law look like as we move to Web 3.0. So I come at this as a business person, a business builder, like many of you, really conscious about the future, the digital future that we build. If I think about, so that's how I came to data stewardship. And if I think about the types of, what does data stewardship mean? I think it means you respect that there's a lot of value in data, and with value comes power. You expect that data can cause real world harms if not treated carefully. We would expect that data stewardship is pretty hard, and when we worked on this problem together through the course of last year, physically with a set of companies of how do we do good data stewardship day to day, how do you operationalise it, it's really hard. And then I would say the fourth aspect of data stewardship is that you should consider it as part of the culture and the value set of your own organisation. It should be inextricably linked. And you should see it as part of walking your talk and what the mission of your companies.
Can I interrupt you there, Rach? Because I know that this is something when we did this piece of work together, that did the data stewardship sit in the hands of the data stewardship responsible human, or how does it manifest in an organisation or a startup? Who's the boss of data stewardship?
I think that if you went, and Jacques, you'll say a lot more about this because Jacques, you're sitting with tech companies all across Australia, trying to do the walking the halls, like the operationalising of it. I think what you find when you look in most organisations is no one is in charge of it, and that is probably one of the biggest gaps. Yep. There's no one who's really got the hat on thinking, how do I treat data really carefully? And
so there's no KPI around data. Should we use that as a segue to you, Jacques? Can you share a little bit with us about what you're actually experiencing with clients?
Sure. Is that working?
Yep.
As Rachel's alluded to, I probably work with on a bit more of your perhaps bread and butter matters, the transactional matters that large businesses, tech businesses have day to day, and so often the question that we're looking at is really what does the law require, not which I describe what you're talking about. Data stewardship as more what what should be required and what would be the best way and the ethical way of dealing with data when you have these vast troves being created and the responsibility that comes with that. So often clients are really asking me, what do we have to do? What do we have to have in our contracts? What do we have to ensure that our service providers and customers are agreeing to? So there's, I guess if I were to put them into categories, broad categories, I'd say that you've got one class of business that we might call data maximalists, who are, or data hungry perhaps, and they see the value.
Some people call those people data extractors. But
Sure.
that would be a negative way of phrasing them. Data maximalists.
I thought data hungry was negative enough, but
I think it's a natural thing.
yeah, a business that certainly sees the value in data, or in many cases, and obviously there's the famous cases, the big titans, who base their entire business on data, and the more the better. And they're really, out there trying to hold as much as they can and then manipulate it and come up with novel ways of monetizing that information. And then at the, I think the broader category, the category that most businesses that are not focused on that belong in are probably just, they see data as obviously relevant to their business, and they see where it's coming in as, where it arises from their ordinary business operations. And they really don't particularly want to deal with it, which I think goes to the point you were making. There's often not a person who's designated as the person to deal with data who's responsible for that, even though we have things like privacy officers and so on. They often, they want to minimize their role, they want to minimize the level of obligation and what they're doing within the organization, and they're just trying to navigate those rules and regulations, the things they must do. And then the final category, I'd say, which we were calling data minimalists when we were discussing this before, but also I think you could say that perhaps data ethicists, and they see that there's a problem. They see that there's something that they need to deal with and that they have a responsibility, and they're trying to figure out, first of all, the minimalism comes from what is the minimum amount of data I need to provide this service, to provide this benefit that has been agreed to by the person I'm collecting the data from, and then how can I treat that data in the best possible way. So I think they're the sort of areas I see.
Thanks, Jacques. So in my head, I'm trying to think of what the audience would like to know, and I think, okay, I would like to know, well, tell me if I've got a checklist of what are the sort of the red line items on data that I should be looking for from a data maximalist position legally, like where's the no-go zones, and then from a minimalist position, so if I added some data stewardship policies in there, what would I then be collecting from your perspective, Rachel? So just so I've got no addition, so I'm not in, for those of you who don't know, in the UK, for example, there's Gdpr Compliance. Some of you might have heard of that. That means that there are different requirements on you as an organisation to, for example, give people something called the right to erasure. That means I am saying to you legally, if somebody comes to you, to your company and says, I want my data back, you need to be able to give it back to them or take them off the record. The reason that's a trouble with big public permissionless blockchains oftentimes is that information's already been embedded in a previous block. So some of you might be aware of that issue. In Australia, we don't have GDPR, we don't have right to erasure, but a lot of companies who do international business already work to the GDPR standard. But I'll let Jacques answer my question. If there's a checklist of when you're advising a company of what they need to be aware of on their data rights, what's the considerations?
Well, I guess the first thing is that that the main regime dealing with data in Australia is the privacy law. So there are, there's various ways that the law, the legal obligations arise in relation to data, but the main one is privacy, and that means dealing with personal information, which is defined as information about a person or that could reasonably identify the person when combined with other information. So that information is what triggers the first, you need to really consider what you're doing and make sure you're complying with the law. And then you've got things like having a privacy policy and dealing with all the mandated requirements there and then complying with that. That's pretty much the process. And the way that a lot of data minimalists deal with that, one of the ways is to say, well, we don't necessarily need all of this information about people, and if we're going to be treating them respectfully and trying to be responsible with their data, one way is to just not to take it at all. One extreme example of this was a philanthropic venture that was creating an app that was going to be used around the world for various purposes to try and help the people that were using it. I won't go into too much detail. But they could have, when you set up an app, often people go, okay, name, address, date of birth, and the full gamut of questions. They're almost just so standard nobody even notices them. But when they talked through what they were trying to do, they realized they didn't really need any of that. They didn't even need a name. So they said, put in whatever you want, call yourself whatever you want. And in that way, they didn't store any information about the users of their app. And obviously that would mean, if they were a commercial venture, they wouldn't be able to monetize any of that data, if that was a consideration, but for them it wasn't. And then they didn't have to worry about the worst consequences that could arise from having people's personal information. And they kind of showed in that way that they were, what they were about and what their focus was.
So we just flip, thanks Jack, we'll flip to you Rachel of how do we do that at the minimalist level in a little bit more granularity. But I think that most people in the room, I say there's a bit of a generational difference because I look at how my children are with data and they're much more relaxed about giving over data for a Big Mac, for example. But we do have privacy overhang where we start to think, I don't really like it that social media company A actually knows I'm having an affair. I'm not having an affair, but you get the point, okay? And that's very, very clear to people who are collecting all information about you. So when it is that you are the golden rule from all cultures, doing unto others as you would like to have them do unto you, that also applies to your data policy. So if your data policy is to be as extractive as possible, but you actually personally would prefer your data not to be extracted, this is an approach for you.
I'm going to answer the question by giving you a handful of macro categories to think about. And I think I would call these principles. The first couple are transparency and participation. These are fairly obvious to people in Web3, like be very transparent about what you're doing. That also means be very transparent about what you're collecting. And the second one is be participatory, so have community participation in designing your products and projects. And I think that compared to the walled gardens of Web 2, Web 3 does this very well. And this is quite culturally ingrained in Web 3 companies. The third category is data integrity. So ensuring that your data is quality, it's correct. The information you hold about people is right. I think from Web 2 to Web 3, data integrity is fundamentally solved through our immutability principles. So there's we see a big gap in data integrity in the old world and the new world. A couple more though where the jury is still out or where there's still a fair degree of risk is around privacy, around accountability, and around fair value exchange. These three principles of data stewardship. Privacy is respecting people's personal information. Now, I think what I want to impress on you guys is to think about the direction of travel of privacy. Privacy used to be considered, and in the Privacy Act, is considered personal identifiable information. But if you take a macro view of privacy, it's about knowing someone it's about knowing someone and their intimate habits and their decision-making processes. And as we see in Web 2, the way we get to know someone is by tracking their activity. So it's well beyond just your identifiable information. It's about the type of stuff you search, the habits and routines that you have online. And that's building up a very, very rich profile about you as a person, and you are making consequential decisions based on what people know about your activity. So I think take a broader view of privacy when you are thinking about what you collect. The fifth, I'm on to my fifth principle about accountability. You need to have a principle that you'll be accountable for what you do. You'll take responsibility for it. You'll be responsible for the upside and the downside, and the positive consequences of the projects that you put out and the negative consequences. So the loop of accountability, I think, is something that's it's an enormous area of investigation in Web3 as we decentralise governance. And I want to hear, Madam Speaker, you talk a bit more about DAOs and the decentralisation of governance and these outstanding questions about accountability. The sixth one, though, that I want to talk about is fair value exchange. I mean, we assume that the economy runs in a market of fair value exchange. But you should think about that in the micro sense when you're putting products out there, when you're building your projects. Fair value exchange means, you know, if I think about the micro question of what do you collect about someone, if you're a minimalist, you only collect what you're going to usefully use for the user or the data subject. But a broader definition of fair value exchange is that there's information symmetry between buyer and seller. And for me, there's still really big questions about whether we have information symmetry versus information asymmetry in Web 3.0 markets.
Thanks, Rach. And I mean, let's bring it back to the blockchain community. So, you know, there's some privacy-enhancing tools that are there in the market. There's some really interesting things that are being done about giving tools and platforms that are giving individuals the ability to harness their own data. But let's put this in theme and understand why data is important, is because my favourite saying is data is the mother's milk of AI. So if we think about what's coming in terms of artificial intelligence, and that could be a long, you know, it could be a long road, it could be a short road, depends with quantum computing what will happen. If we don't have integrity in our data and we don't have useful data, then we also have AI systems, particularly as what we tend to see in the law. We are seeing M&A activity which is based on being able to aggregate data sets across disparate horizontals and verticals. So we just want that to land for a second. If you are a startup and you're collecting data and you've got this dream to be a unicorn one day, and God bless you, maybe you will be. If you are that person and you collect in a particular type of way, a maximalist approach to data because that's your commercial model, that data set may be purchased by another organisation at some point who's going to put that data together with another group of data and to be able to create enormous amount of information about people that can be used in AI systems. And that doesn't just watch people, that pushes people. The same way we saw through social media companies, it's used to push behaviours in a forward way. So these are all things that we talk about, governance of Web 3.0, what's coming ahead of us. Everybody here is a steward. If you aren't a steward, I would invite you to become a steward of data going forward. And let's end with a positive note about data. My favourite thing about the blockchain is it enables us to take decisions, for example, around data. If you're a data aggregator like a large institution, and we use the blockchain to hold that data in a reconciled way between organisations as opposed to just leaving it in the hands and governance of a centralised institution, that's a wonderful thing about blockchain, being able to right that balance of power in respect of data. Have either of you got any thoughts around how the blockchain is, or distributed ledger technology, because they're not the same thing, how the data can be better used using those technologies? Or is that a tricky question? Or maybe I'll throw it to the audience. There we go. We're off-piste. Anyone want to add something before we finish, or am I right on time, Ian? Right on time. Okay. Saved by the bell. Thank you very much. And if you want to talk about data stewardship or data generally, come and talk to us afterwards.